Welcome everybody to Raising Multilinguals Live. My name is Tetsu Young from Ask Tetsu.
Hello everyone, my name is Ute Limacher-Riebold from Ute's International Lounge.
Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Rita Rosenbach from multilingualparenting.com. And today we have yet another highly interesting topic. We will speak about cognitive development of bilingual babies. And as our very special guest, we have Dr. Dean D'Souza from Anglia Ruskin University here in the UK. Welcome, Dean.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Your research that focuses on the early cognitive and neurophysiological processes of the language development of typically developing children, but also atypically developing infants. This is a topic that is so interesting. I mean, you have also created a lab for early learning and neurodevelopment. Please do tell us a little bit about that as well, because I find that fascinating and so promising for future research.
Yeah, so I set up this lab primarily to understand what happens really early in development. So as you mentioned, we're looking at atypically developing children as well as typically developing children. So bilingualism is just one of the aspects we're looking at. But the reason why is because we feel that early in development is such an important part of development. I mean, changes that happen very early in life can affect our future lives, how we develop, how we learn. And so I'm really interested, and especially because so much happens in the first year of life in terms of neural brain changes, cognitive development. Huge amount happens. I mean, you just need to look at a newborn and then look at what happens when they're 1 or 2 or 3 years of age, and the difference is just staggering. And you know, they go from being a small creature that's really relying on their mother for sustenance and so on, to becoming a walking, crawling, exploring organism that's learning a huge amount, even languages, which visually seeing things that even our most advanced artificial intelligence struggles to do effectively. So much happens early in development, and changes early in development can have cascading effects over developmental time. And so this is why it's I think it's such an important period in life that we need to learn and understand more about. And so that's why I set up the lab in order to try to kind of understand what's happening early in development, how these infants grow.
Yes, it's fascinating how you have this little baby in your lap. You think, oh, gosh, they were never this small, and then soon you have somebody who's ripping down your tablecloth and all the china from the table. So yeah, it's really amazing.
Well, we do know that those first few years are really the period where the brain synapses are connecting, and it's the fastest period of brain development. So I always tell my folks, earlier the better when it comes to all sorts of development, but especially languages. So good, you know.
I mean, the most interesting thing for me is when we're looking at the infant brain, not only is the brain the most complex thing in the known universe, but also as an infant, it's just trying to adapt to its environment. And so it's not only is it the most complex thing in the universe, but also it's very flexible during that especially that first year of life. And so it's really adaptive and really sensitive to the world around it. And so it's got massive capacity to learn. And it really needs to kind of tune all these complex connections, and so complexity just rises at a very fast rate in these early children. So it really is a fascinating and critically important period of development.
Absolutely. And I just have to ask this before we go into the actual topic, but because we don't know by far everything about how the brain functions yet. So would you dare to think where can we go with brain research and the cognitive development?
It's a very difficult question to answer, and the reason why is because maybe traditionally we used to have very simple ideas about development. So we would have these ideas that everything is encoded in the genes. So once we know how genes work, and then life would be a piece of cake. But unfortunately, the reality is that life is not that simple. And what happens is, I like to use the phrase context dependent, not just myself, but other researchers, because really we're developing within a context. So for example, even genes, they're turned on and off depending on what's happening around them. Mm-hmm. So if you think about it, I have the same genes in my thumb than I do in my eye, but the cells are completely different. So and the reason why isn't because there's some program. So we were 50 years ago we would use the words like blueprints, like the DNA is our genetic blueprint, and everything is just unfolds because of this genetic instructions. But actually it's not how it works at all. It's very, very complex. And we're basically, how development unfolds really does depend on what's happening around us. So how a cell forms depends on what other cells are doing around it, depends on what genes it has, of course, but it also depends on the overall structure. So cells within a brain are going to develop differently from cells in my thumb, for example, and so basically there's all these different layers of complexity, and everything is interacting, and so we now realize how difficult it is. So when we say things like the brain is the most complex device in the known universe, we're not exaggerating. It really is, because we can understand basic principles in physics. We understand what happens with an electron when two electrons collide, or black holes and so on. Mm-hmm. But complexity, how we adapt to our environments, how we grow and develop, it's much more complex than we thought it was just 50, 70 years ago. So in terms of the future, I think I'm hopeful, because our technology is becoming better and better, and rapidly so, actually, and the computers we're using are becoming more and more powerful. So I don't think we're in a good position at the moment to really understand development, but I think every year I'm seeing technology become better and better, and so I am hopeful that in the future we will, we're going to be learning a lot more. It's going to be a rapid rise in how much we know about development. So it's exciting for the next generation, but also I think hopefully for our generation as well.
That sounds really, really exciting. Thank you, Dean, for that insight. So in your research, you have found that there's a difference in the development of the cognitive ability between in babies that grow up in a bi or multilingual environment, if you compare them to those growing up in a monolingual environment. So can you tell us a little bit more about this research?
Yes, so what motivated this research was the classic idea in the bilingualism literature is that there's a bilingual advantage, a cognitive advantage, and the basic idea goes back to a guy called Green, who worked at still is working at UCL, and he came up with this idea that when we are speaking two or more languages, all languages become activated in the brain, and so we have to suppress one in order to speak another. And especially if we're living in a very complex environment where we might be talking in one language to our partner and another language to our parents, and maybe we're doing some code switching with someone else, and so it's very complex. And essentially what happens, the idea is that we have to inhibit the languages we're not using, so we can speak the ones how we're intending to do so. And so this kind of trains up our cognitive capacity. But then, if this is the case, and this might be true, there's certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that our languages are activated, and so there is evidence that suggests that we do have to inhibit. So there's this may well be the case, but in that case, we shouldn't expect disadvantage in infants, because in infants they don't need to speak a language. They are they're listening to languages, but they're not speaking it. They're too young to speak languages. So this is why I wanted to look at this particular age group. So I was looking at children before they can speak a language. So I was looking at infants between 7 and 9 months of age. And what interested me is whether just mere exposure, just being in a bilingual environment where you're just hearing words from different languages, can that have an effect on cognitive development? And I thought that's a really interesting question to find out. And there has been one piece of research that did find an effect about 10 years ago now, I think, but it wasn't replicated. So it was kind of important that we were able to see whether it can be replicated and see whether we can find other things as well. So what we did was, of course, we can't do a lot of tasks with infants because you can't give them instructions. You can't. A lot of the tasks we do with adults just won't work with children. And so in classic studies, what happens is you tell the participant that they need to press this button when they see this, or that button when they see something else. You can't do that with infants. Fortunately, we can use something called eye tracking technology. And what this does is the infant just watches things as they happen on the screen, and then the computer can work out where the child is looking on the screen. And so we can design some really clever studies to kind of work out what the child is thinking or what's happening in the brain based on where the child is looking. Because, for example, of course, if you're a child, you're going to look at what's interesting. You can't really stop yourself. So essentially what we did was we showed pictures of little animations on the screen, and we made it as interesting as possible, so the child was engaged. And the good thing about this technology is that if the child looks at something, then the computer can show it something else. So we can make it really interactive, where we're responding to where the child is looking. And what we found was that infants raised in bilingual homes, and when I say bilingual, I actually mean bilingual or multilingual, so 2 or more languages. These children, they were more likely, they were faster at disengaging their attention from one visual stimulus. So if they were looking at one thing, they're faster at disengaging their attention in order to shift it to look at another thing. And they were shifting their attention more frequently between the different things on the screen as things would appear on the screen. They can shift their attention more quickly. So basically what we found in some was that the infants, so these, don't forget, these were just 7 to 9 month old infants, they were quicker at redirecting their attention, and they were redirecting their attention more frequently than infants from monolingual homes. And so that was what we found.
That is really fascinating. Yes, because we are talking about, like you say, 7 to 9 months old. What is also fascinating is how you got them to stay still for that long, but that's a different discussion.
The tricky bit is you need to have it as exciting as possible, and then you can have the task as short as possible. So it's getting that balance between.
But I suppose it's a good thing as well, because you know that what you get is real data. It's genuine. There are no lies or pretense or trying to be better than what you are, which can and will happen amongst adults and then even older children. But infants, you will get the real data there. Fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we're hoping, and hopefully we'll get even more naturalistic data. Hopefully we're going to start a project where we're going to actually do studies in the child's home. And you know, a lot of these studies you just couldn't do in the past, and that's what I mean, whereby the technology is becoming better and better and better. And so I think we're going to learn a lot more over the years, simply because we can use better techniques.
Absolutely, yeah. So if you would study them in their kind of natural environment, so to say, that would give even better data to you.
Yeah.
Yes, fantastic.
Yeah. So the good thing about this, at least, is that they could move around. The screen was, you know, it's very children think what they're interested in. So it was somewhat naturalistic, but the next step is to see what they're like in the home. So in a familiar environment, using slightly more mobile technology, what do we find there? So that would be the next step.
Wonderful. And so, yeah.
Is it okay? So we do. Your research focuses on whether the child who grew up in a monolingual environment or a bilingual, multilingual environment tracks different stimuli on screen, right? So I can immediate what comes to mind is, what are all the parameters that you are controlling, like, or the key parameters? Because with an infant like that at that age, there must be so many confounding elements that you have to control for in order for your research, for your data to be validated. So maybe the top 2 or 3 key things that you find that you must control in this setting.
So in many ways, first of all, we in terms of their visual exploration, we're just trying to keep it as simple as possible. So the first thing we just wanted to know is, how do they disengage? How quickly can they disengage their attention? So there were actually quite a few studies, experiments within this one short period, but that was the first question, because you need to be able to disengage your attention in order to shift it elsewhere. And so how we did this was, we would have something really engaging at first, and so the infant would look at that at first, and then as soon as the infant was looking at it, so when the computer detected that they were looking at that particular thing on the screen, what would happen was that stimulus would or that visual kind of cartoon would stop, so it would freeze, and then something more interesting would occur. And essentially the child has to disengage their attention from the first one in order to shift it to the next one. And there will be different conditions in order to control exactly what's happening. So in one condition, both stimuli would stay on the screen, and so the child has to disengage their attention from the first one. In the other condition, there might be a tiny little gap, so 200 millisecond gap. So what this means is that the first thing completely disappears. So for just 200 milliseconds, there's nothing on the screen, and this gives the attentional system time to disengage. And so then they should be quicker at moving their attention to the stimulus on the side, for example, when it appears on the side. And so you get a measure of how quickly they shift their attention. And then you can compare that to how quickly it takes them to disengage and shift their attention. And so you can subtract these cognitive processes to work out how quickly the infants take to do certain things. So how quickly it takes to shift their attention, how quickly it takes to disengage their attention. And you know, you can use it to work out exactly how many times they switch their attention from one to another and things like that. So really, the parameters are kind of about the different conditions. So there's lots of tiny little conditions, and of course the infant isn't aware of these conditions because it happens so fast. So 200 milliseconds is so quick that they're not really aware of it, but the attentional system in the brain does make a difference to how it reacts.
What about the subjects that you recruit? Is there some form of I guess parameters that you control for? I don't know, number of languages or just specific type of languages. I mean, that's really going into a lot of detail. I think it would be very difficult in such an experiment, but I don't know.
But I think a very good question, because so this was just our first step, if you like. We just wanted to find out whether there are these bilingual adaptations early in infancy. So what we did was we wanted to get enough infants, and in order to be able to do this, so we tested over 100 infants, and so over 50 infants from monolingual homes and over 50 infants from bilingual homes. And what we wanted to do, because it was our first step, for our next step, what we want to do is we want to get a larger grant so we can do an even larger study and include as many children as possible. But so in this initial step, we just wanted to include as many children as possible, and we were just comparing what happens between a monolingual home and a bi or multilingual home. So essentially, if you're hearing 2 or more languages, and the reason why is just for the basic theoretical ideas. We hypothesized that infants being raised in bilingual or multilingual homes, they're being raised in a more complex language environment. So the languages they hear are going to be more varied. So there's going to be more variability in terms of the phonemes they hear, for example. So in many ways, it's going to be more unpredictable, because we're in a monolingual home. You don't need to pay attention all the time because you know what language you're going to hear. It's more predictable. Whereas in a bilingual environment, it's more unpredictable. So we wanted to simply know whether that simple distinction between a simple monolingual environment and a more complex bilingual environment, whether that confers or gives rise to any kind of bilingual adaptation. So do infants adapt differently to these more complex language environments? What we did do is we tried to collect as many measures as possible. So for example, what we found was that the infants who were more likely, so the infants who were more exposed to English, so for example, if they heard 2 languages, but 90% of it was English, for example, then the effect was much smaller with them. Whereas if they didn't hear English as much, so let's say it was 50-50 between, or maybe 30% English and 30% another language and 40% another, then the effect was much greater. So we collected other measures and fed that into the analyses to work out to get a better measure. But I think what we really need to do, like I said, this was an initial step just to compare just a simple environment versus a complex environment. But what we really want to do in our future study is collect even more children and collect even more detailed variables. And then we can try to work out what is it about the bilingual language environment that drives this. Is it if the more languages the child hears, that's what drives these effects? Or is it maybe this code switching? So maybe, for example, if one parent in one single stream and one single sentence, there's 2 or 3 languages in that one simple sentence, maybe that's what drives the effects, because that's maybe more unpredictable than, let's say, if one parent just speaks one language and another parent another language. So we'll hopefully we'll be able to delve a little bit deeper and understand a little bit more about how these bilingual adaptations arise. in a larger study.
Yes, I have a question because it's actually something that I find interesting in these studies, because we are talking about languages. We think about the spoken language, right? And you want to see the differences between monolinguals and bilinguals, or maybe multilinguals, in their reaction. But then you do not use sounds to detect this, but you use movements. So what I always expect somehow at some point is, okay, now we have detected that there is a difference to some extent in the eye movement that you have in these kind of research approach. But the next step, I always am looking for what happens next with the detection or the recognition of the sounds, the different sounds. How is the child reacting to that? I mean, we can trace the eye movement. We cannot necessarily trace what they are hearing, but we can trace, or we can also record what activity in the brain is on when they are hearing different languages. So my question is a bit more complicated maybe, but do you think you can combine these kind of two different methods or more methods that are available nowadays, and we can compare them and combine them to have a further result?
Yes, so in many ways there has been a lot of research looking at the sounds, and the reason why is because if you think about it, we would expect differences to occur as early as before the child is born, because when you're in the womb, you can hear your mum's voice, and essentially what they've found is that there are differences. So basically, the bilingual brain is changing in response to the different sounds from before they're even born. And you can do lots of simple experiments that demonstrate this. So, for example, you can see whether the child reacts differently to familiar languages versus unfamiliar languages. And so you can already work out what aspects of the language the child finds it easier to differentiate. And so there's a lot of differences between bilingual infants and monolingual infants in terms of how they process sounds. And I think without any, so the reason why I'm interested in visual, because actually initially one of our experiments had two versions. It had an auditory version and a visual version, and but we dropped the auditory version to keep it short, to keep the whole study short, because obviously they're infants and you don't want it to go on forever. But the reason why is because for me, what was more interesting is that, okay, we know that there's going to be differences in the language domain because they're hearing different languages, and so they have to adapt to that language domain. So for me, what I found more curious was, does it affect the visual domain? Because it should affect the auditory domain, the language, how we process sounds. But the visual domain, that's more of an open question. And then if it does affect the visual domain, how and why? Or just visual attention versus auditory attention. It should affect auditory attention, but does that mean that it would affect visual attention? And if so, why? So that was kind of that's why my experiments were just using visual stimuli. But yeah, the exciting thing is the technology has improved to such an extent that nowadays we can combine these. So in the study that I want to carry out, if I get the funding to do so, is to combine. So I've already done newer imaging research, and I've done eye tracking research, but I've never combined the two. So what would be really interesting to do is to combine the two and see what happens over developmental time. Yeah. So that you can now have brain imaging techniques whereby it's just a little cap, a really lightweight cap you just put on the infant's head, and you can have these eye tracking eye trackers that are very mobile, and so you can have these devices that record sounds, so you can understand what the sounds, what the child is hearing in their environment. So the technology is becoming more and more mobile, whereas before you put the infant in a huge scanner, and so it'd be very unfamiliar environment. So nowadays we can do this. We can combine all this technology, and so hopefully my next project will be looking at that. And over time, because I think that's an important thing as well, is to look at how it changes over time, especially because early in life the brain is so flexible, and so you want to know, you know, are there sensitive periods where the brain is more likely to change as a result of being brought up in a bilingual environment than a monolingual environment. So these are some exciting questions that we hope to answer.
Absolutely, Dean, and you do have to tell us when you have something new to come with, because we'd love to hear how you can follow this up and then where it takes us, because it's so fascinating. I'll just shortly go back to your research. You've done it with the infants, but do you know anything about so the infants, they're bilingual, the infants that hear 2 or more languages in their environment, they are quicker at switching attention. So do you know anything about retaining this ability? And is this something that kind of fades away if let's say the child doesn't grow up to be bilingual? Or do you know anything about that? I know I'm probably asking about the future here.
No, so that's a really good question, and in fact that was our next step as well. We wanted to know, and so what we did was we ran a very similar study. So it was actually an identical study. We used the same tasks. So we deliberately designed these tasks to be used by children of all ages, and so that means we can also use it with adults. And so what we did was we ran the study with adults, and so adults would just sit there and just watch what was on the screen. And our question was, would we see a similar effect in adults? And so what we did was so as I said, we ran the same tasks, and what we found was that if you were among our adults, if you learned your second language early in life, so we also measured, you know, when did they learn their second language? Was it, you know, were they exposed to their second language from birth, or did they learn it later on as a child and so on? So we measured how long for each adult. We found out when they learned their second or third or fourth language and so on. And what we found was that the adults who had learned their second language early in life, they were faster at disengaging their attention, just like the infants, than adults who learn the second language later in life. So
where do you draw the kind of border between early in life and later in life? How?
So the interesting thing is we didn't want to draw a border. What we did was we collected a continuous measure. So we just had it from, I think in the study, among our bilinguals, it was from 0. So there was so they learned simultaneously. They learned both languages simultaneously, all the way to, I think some of our adults learned their second language. It was 35 years after the first language, or at least 28 years along roughly 30 years. And so we had a continuous measure, and so we can see, we can kind of look at it over time, and basically it wasn't that there was a cutoff point, and we didn't set an arbitrary cutoff point. We didn't divide people into early and late bilinguals. All we did was we just looked at what effect it has, how long the distance between your second language and your first language, what effect that has. And so that was really exciting because we didn't impose any artificial boundary. And what we found was that, actually earlier, the better they were at disengaging their attention, or the faster they were at disengaging their attention. So that was really interesting. And obviously, what this suggests, because these were bilinguals, so our adults, we also looked at monolinguals as well, but what we were most interested in is the bilingual group, because we wanted to know whether what we saw early in infancy, whether that lasts into adulthood, and it seemed to be the case. So the idea is that if you're a bilingual infant, so if you're an infant and you're raised in a bilingual environment, it's a more complex environment. So you need to explore your visual environment more in order to keep up or even with your monolingual peers. And how you would do this is you might spend more time looking at a person's mouth movements, for example, or so the idea is that you're more likely as an infant to explore your environment in order to learn, in order to better learn from it. And so the idea was that we look at this as a bilingual adaptation, because you're adapting to your bilingual environment. And we wanted to know whether these early bilingual adaptations last into adulthood, and they seem to. So because if you think about it, if you learn your second language when you're an adult, then the reason why you would have faster attention would have to be very different, because you're going to learn the language in a very different way as an infant learns it. So the reasons might be very different, and that's why we were quite interested to learn to do this second study.
There is a question. We have several questions. If you don't mind, I would like to share them because they're all very interesting. There is one from Anna. I would be interested to know how the quick shifting is developing. So if it helps in their future development, and how.
Mm-hmm. So what we hypothesized was that, so we were trying to think, how would an infant, so if you're an infant and you're being raised in a more complex language environment, what are the kind of things you need to do in order to keep up with your monolingual peers? Obviously it's not conscious, but the point is, infants, they need to understand what's happening around them. So all infants, for example, will look to the mouth if they're not sure, if they need a little bit more visual information. And the idea is that in a more complex environment, you're just naturally going to look more at the mouth or things like that, or look more at gestures, hand gestures, or maybe look to see who's talking, or maybe even focus on if you're bilingual, maybe it's important to focus on people in the background to get more information, or to look at toys. And so maybe what's happening is you're naturally going to be switching attention more frequently as a child. And then interestingly, as you develop, so this is the interesting thing, why I think development is so important. As you develop, you develop other skills as well, your motor skills. So for example, you're more likely to reach for toys and explore toys, and eventually you're going to be shuffling off exploring your visual environment. And so the idea is, maybe with bilingual infants, maybe as they're getting older, as they're becoming 7, 8, 9 months of age, 10 months and so on, and exploring more, maybe they'll be focusing on the toys they're exploring, because that's what infants are interested in. But if you're bilingual, you still might be wanting to quickly flick your glance to a speaker. So maybe this is driving you to switch attention even faster, because you want to look at a speaker's mouth, but you also want to look at your toy. So you're more likely to switch attention more quickly. And so maybe this is how this is being driven over development. So you're learning to disengage your attention, shift it, redirect your attention back to the toy, redirect it back to the mouth, maybe to someone else who enters the room, and maybe looking at their hands and so on. And so over time, maybe you're developing your ability to direct attention. and so it becomes you become faster and stronger at it. And who knows, maybe at a certain age this increase, maybe it plateaus. But the interesting thing is, clearly there was a difference in the adults. So even if it does plateau, it plateaus at a higher level than the monolingual infants or the individuals who became bilingual much later in life.
What I understand is, because it's a bit confusing if we say, okay, then you switch from one thing to the other, it can become like maybe parents could then doubt, okay, then my child cannot focus enough. But I understand that what you say is actually the contrary, so that they can focus on what is important or essential. So they can focus on what they need for the task to do. Yeah, so it might seem that they get distracted, but they actually check, no, this is not important now, so I concentrate on this one. So this is, if I understand you right, what is happening, because I think we had other talks as well where we were talking about the adults and their capacity to direct the attention to the different tasks and to switch off distractions. And that was a positive side effect from being multilingual. Or
I mean, it's those two things. Research they do tie together in that we have the disengaging bit. That to be able to focus on something, you need to be disengage from the previous one, so you can refocus. It's highly interesting.
And that's why I like to call it an adaptation rather than just an advantage, because an advantage is a very general term. But what does it actually mean? In reality, what's happening is that these infants, they are doing what's best for them. I mean, that's essentially what they're doing. We're adapting to the world around us. So the infants are going to, if everything is working, okay, then the infant is going to adapt in the best way possible. So if the language is more complex, then they're going to learn to shift their attention more frequently. But they're not going to do it if it's going to cause them a disadvantage. They're adapting to fit their environment as best they can, and that's what we as living organisms, living systems do. So essentially, it's not necessarily going to be an advantage or a disadvantage, except in the sense that they're going to be developing to fit their environment as best as possible. And that means that maybe they do end up with some advantages. So for example, I mean, this would be something that you would need to test, of course. So it may be the case that that by becoming better at redirecting their attention, maybe that means they're going to be better at better at other tasks later on in life. But we'd need to test that to see. But the important thing is that it's very unlikely to be the case that bilingual infants will adapt in a way that causes them an immediate disadvantage. So they're not going to be just shifting attention if it's not giving them any advantage. They will only be shifting attention if it gives them an advantage. And so they will be and that's why they might shift their attention to their mouth, but then quickly back to the toy. And so that might be the advantage that if there is an advantage, that might be the advantage that they're gaining, is this ability to redirect attention quickly. But they're not going to do it if that causes them a disadvantage, because
and also, of course, whether something, I mean, it's a difference development, and that's an important thing to remember. That we don't have to kind of judge it, say, like you say, advantage or disadvantage. It's a difference, and then it depends on what kind of environment a child grows up in and which types of skills are needed. Sometimes maybe you need to, like, I can imagine that in a school environment, it would be good to be able to focus and disengage and focus again and in other scenarios it might not be. Like if you're driving a car, it's not always necessarily that good to react very quickly to things around you until you've taken everything into account. It's just as an example. So yeah.
I think that's spot on, actually. That's exactly it. I think that's why I like the term adaptation, because I think it more accurately conveys what we're looking at.
Perfect. Did we have more questions from the audience?
Yeah, there was one from Yosem Shan. This is very interesting. I was wondering if there was a difference between bilingual children and children raised with more than 2 languages. So talking about this, maybe then this switch, is it faster in children who are exposed to 5 languages? I'm thinking of you, Tetsu.
Yeah, weren't we just talking about this a few minutes ago about that new research that came out from Tokyo University? That's sort of on this line. It's called the multi-enhancement model or something along those lines.
Activations, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, and hopefully this is something we'll look at in a later study as well, when we have a larger sample of infants. We do have a bit of that data already, but we just haven't analyzed it as well as we would like. So the most we've analyzed is that if you are predominantly one language, then the effect is quite small compared to children who are more but who are more exposed to different languages, I guess. So but we need to look at that in more detail, and we haven't done that yet, partly because although we tested over 100 children, we only tested just over 50 were from bilingual homes. So I'd like to collect a larger sample before I look at that in more depth. And of course, there could be a lot of other interesting factors that I think we already mentioned, such as maybe it's about how the language is used in the environment. And that's what I didn't collect. So in the next study, what we hope to use is these tiny little devices which record the sound environment and can automatically analyze some of that itself. And basically what we want to know is, for example, is the parent using several languages in one sentence? And if so, is that going to have an effect? Because according to our theory, it should do, because according to our theory, the infant is adapting. The reason why you see these adaptations is because they're being exposed to a more complex environment, so they need to adapt to it. And so the more complex the environment, then the greater the effect you should see. So we should see if a child is exposed to lots of languages, and then we should see a greater effect than if a child is just exposed to 2 languages, or if there's lots of code switching. And that would be quite interesting to see, because I don't think that's really been explored yet that much. So there has been a couple of studies that have looked in it a little bit, but mostly in the past, these studies have used questionnaires. And what they found recently was that parents underestimate how much code switching they do. And by code switching, I mean speaking 2 or more languages in one go. So parents, underestimate how much of that they do. So I think we really need, and I think a study is about to be published soon in Canada. I can't remember what university it is, but we need to do more of this kind of research, and so hopefully that's what I'll be doing in future, so we can quantify the complexity of the language environment and see whether that has an effect. Because maybe our theory is correct and it will have an effect, or maybe it won't. Maybe it's just any kind of bilingual environment, and then we'd need to kind of think why. But so it's really good question, and something that we definitely have to look at in future.
And so looking to the future, we have a question from Keith. Keith, about are you looking to have the same children participate in future research?
Yeah, great question. After my heart, because as a developmental scientist, I think it's crucial that we understand development. And a lot of studies, they just look at snapshots in time. So what's happening at this age? What's happening at this age? And really, to understand development, we need to understand how it unfolds over time. And so it really is important to run longitudinal studies. But of course, it's quite costly. Because you need a really large sample. A lot of, not all families can stay. Every families are busy as well, so they can't. So a lot of families drop out. So it needs to be. You do need a lot of studies. A lot of money in order to run these longitudinal studies. And so, hopefully, that's what I'm aiming to do. So I'm gonna be looking at. I'm going to be collecting data from children when they're newborns, just to get an idea of what they're being born into. Then we'll be looking at it over several time points between in the first year of life, because that's the time period I'm most interested in, because it's the time that so much happens and that the brain is so sensitive to the environment. And what happens is the brain specializes as it gets older, so it becomes more adapted to a particular environment as it gets older. And so I'm really interested in this period of time when the environment can have such profound effects on the brain. So I'll be looking at lots of different time points, and then hopefully, depending on the size of our grant, we'll also follow up the children as they get older, because obviously it's important to know, maybe, for example, it's very well me sitting here saying an effect early in infancy is going to have all these cascading effects over developmental time, but maybe it won't. So it's important to run these studies to find out. So definitely, that's a great question, because that's exactly what I want to do. I want to run a longitudinal study.
Technology is definitely going to be on your side as we move forward. Tracking will be easier remotely,
and especially the brain imaging technology is amazing now, because of the when I first started as a PhD student, really the neuroimaging technology was either very rudimentary, very basic, or they were these giant, massive machines, and you had to put the child in, and so you couldn't put the child in within a certain age. You couldn't put, so often what would happen is you'd only really do brain imaging with children from age 5, 6, 7, 8, and older, or you might put an infant in that's sleeping. Or that's been subdued with some, some kind of sleep. I'm not sure, because not many have been done. But you put the child in when they're sleeping, and then you play sounds, and then you kind of hope that the brain works in the same way when it's asleep than when it's awake and active. So it's. But nowadays it's completely different. So nowadays, we've got the technology to really lightweight technology that we can image brain activity at any age, and they can move around. They don't have to stay fixed in a particular place. They can move around, and it's much more natural, because don't forget, we've evolved for action. We haven't evolved to sit still and have our brains scanned while we're sitting still or lying in an fMRI scanner. We've evolved to interact with people. Even animals, there's lots of studies that demonstrate animals learn through interaction. If you just sit them there and you play some kind of sound, so these are songbirds, for example, if you just play songs to birds, they're not going to learn anywhere near as well as if they actually have a real life bird in front of them playing, who's singing to them. And it's because we've evolved in a way where we're social creatures, and we interact, and it's all about action. That's what our brains are for. Our brains are for action. Even when we're asleep, our brains are simulating things that have happened in our environment, and we're processing things that have happened during the day, and we're projecting what might happen. So our brains never sleep.
Yeah.
So it's really, really important that we can study these children with the technology that is developing at such a rapid pace, and it really is getting better every year. It's amazing.
Every time you mentioned the big machine, it makes me think of the Dr. Patricia Kuhl's famous TED Talk, where she shows that machine with the baby in there. This is the front, the cutting edge technology. That was around 2009 or 10 or around that time, right?
All right.
How far we
Yeah, I mean, that was, I haven't actually seen that TED Talk, but I do know what you mean, because I've seen her.
Linguistic genius of babies.
Yes, that's what it's called. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. I mean, yeah, I'll definitely look at that, because I've seen her machine, and it's remarkable, because that is cutting edge technology, and in fact, I was speaking to someone from her lab just this week, because it's a really nice machine in the sense that they tried to make the lab look as child friendly and comfortable as possible. And so they've done some amazing research from that lab. But the interesting thing is, we're now developing. So my partner and her colleagues, they will hope soon to be start to use MEG. That is, again, you can just put it on your head and just walk. You can move around a little bit. And so it's just going to be a little cap. So it's remarkable how the technology, and that hasn't been developed. That's still being developed. It's just getting better and better and better. So and so it's going to be remarkable. I think the studies that are going to come about are going to be more naturalistic, and that's important, because action is what our brain is about.
Absolutely.
So,
Gosh, I just realized that the hour has gone by. And I'm not, as usual. Do we still have some questions from the audience that we should place to Dean, or are there? Yes.
Yeah, there is one from Roya Cavilla. It's very long, so I'm going to sum it up.
Yeah.
Yes, she teaches baby sign language for multilingual families. And she's been searching for research on how using visual gestures for communication affects language development in multilingual babies. Because she's seen how signing bridges the languages for babies in many multilingual families, and she's convinced it's a great support. So, to your knowledge, is there research on this already?
I'm not familiar, unfortunately, with this research in bilinguals and multilinguals. I mean, interestingly, I do work with children with neurodevelopmental disorders, and they find it really useful to learn sign language, especially families with Down syndrome. A lot of them are using Makaton, and so they really find it useful, and so I imagine that it would also be useful for multilinguals and bilinguals, but I've not seen a large study that has investigated this. So maybe, if there is room, hopefully I could add it to our battery of tasks if time permitting. Yeah, because it would be really interesting, really important to find out, because it's something that you can roll out straight away, and you can teach people how to do it, and so it would have immediate impact. So it's a really good one to look at. Yeah.
Yes, especially because you researched with infants between 7 and 9 months, and this is around the time where infants start being able also to make gestures. So that would be interesting to see this combination. Maybe more 9 months, potentially, depending on the child and on when they started learning the gesture.
Yeah.
I think let's take the last question as well from Aude, which is very interesting. I'll put that on the screen here. So she's got children who acquire 2 languages simultaneously but differently. The second born second-born will sense whatever his sibling needs or prefers and will switch accordingly. And then if he's tired, he prefers one language to another. So there she sees differences whether the child between siblings, and also whether the child is tired or not tired.
Yeah, so this is fascinating because it just demonstrates how everything is context dependent. So the infant isn't just going to learn what you want the infant to learn. The infant will learn what motivates the infant. So the infant is part of the infant's context is its sibling. So infants will behave differently depending on how they interact with others. And so this is the interesting thing, and this is why I want to do a much larger study to try to take into account the child's context. You know, what are do they have siblings? How many siblings? What are the siblings' ages? Because that's going to be very important. And so try to understand the relationship between the infant and the sibling, or and their siblings, because essentially this is exactly how we as biological creatures we operate. We're basically adapting to our environment, and basically there's going to be things in our environment that's going to shape us more than others because we want to interact. And so this is the interesting thing. We're not passive learners where you can plan out what we're going to learn. We're going to learn what interests us, what motivates us, and basically children are going to develop very differently depending on how they interact with people around them. And so that's a really interesting observation, because it kind of fits in with what we know about development and how important others are in terms of of individual development. Our peers, I mean, in the past, we often just focus on research between the child and the mother, but actually there's so many different types of families, and not only that, but there's so many. What about the peers? I mean, the children you grow up with, when you go to school, can have a profound effect on your learning and development. And so, so it is really important that we take into account all these different factors, so that the child's context, and that's why we grows bigger and bigger.
Absolutely,
because all these things interact.
We could go on for hours and hours and hours, I think. Ute and Tetsu, do you have any questions yet, or we should probably round up at this point?
Yes, we should, as much as I'd love to continue. But thank you so much, Dean, for this marvelous session. It was definitely stimulating my brain this whole time. It's tremendous. So would you have one last sort of encompassing message for parents out there with regards to how, with the information that you have, like a message?
I guess no, because it's quite difficult, because really development is about balance, and so often I don't like giving one piece of advice or not another, because you want the child to explore, but you don't want to push them into exploring. They'll do it at their own pace. So for me, the most important message is to just create a stimulating environment. Don't push them, don't force them to be stimulated, but just to give them. What you want to do is you want to create an environment that allows the child to explore at their own pace. So, you want to give them very different toys to explore. You just got to kind of create that an enriched environment, really. But really just be sensitive to the child's needs. They will go at their own pace. You don't need to force. Don't need to force anything on them.
That's amazing advice. I think it really is in line with what we're about. We do talk about raising kids in different languages, but I think more important than that is the bond, the environment that you create for the child. It's everything about your communication with the child. So thank you for that excellent message. As we wrap up and look forward to the next session, it will be another very relevant session for the period that we live in, as Dean was talking about technology. We'll have, let me put this up on the screen for our next session.
Yes, and on Tuesday, 20th of April, we're very honored to have Professor Ludovica Serratrice from the University of Reading as our guest to share the insights of her study on the home language development during lockdown. Because the ongoing pandemic has changed everyone's lives in ways that we could not have imagined. So during the sessions, we will explore how changes during the lockdown have affected our children's language development. Again, please join us on Tuesday, 20th of April at 1 p.m. New York, 6 p.m. London, and 7 p.m. Paris time.
Fantastic. Thank you again, Dean,
Thank you so much.
for sharing your expertise. Thank you to everybody who stuck around until now.
Thank you for the interesting questions.
Exactly. So thank you for watching on Facebook and on YouTube. And we will see you again in 2 weeks. Definitely the 20th of April.
Yes.
At the same place on the same channel. So we'll see you then. Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.